All right, so everyone, please welcome back to the show my brother Spencer Cropper to talk about Houses of the Holy, Led Zeppelin's fifth album, which just turned 50 and happens to be your birthday album, released on March 26th, 1973. So if ever there was a fitting episode to have you on, it's this one.
It was once a fitting gift from you to me, a birthday gift,
That's right.
CD of this.
That's right.
Yeah, and it has turned out to be my favorite Led Zeppelin album, and it's my one where I don't have like any song that I skip, like when it just comes on. It's my one
Really
where I'm like, this is like not saying that the other ones have skips, but like sometimes I won't be in the mood for certain songs from the first
interesting.
the first three. I mean, four, I don't have any skips there.
Why don't
But
we why don't we start there? What would your skips be on the others?
starting with my skips, just oust me from the start. What would you skip? All right, let's debunk that. You're gonna hate me for these. I skipped Black Mountainside. Sorry. Uh, uh, Moby Dick. You know.
Fair.
Three. We just talked about this one.
What hats off?
Yeah,
Yeah, I think that's particularly damning when you have a weak opener or closer. But
you just can't do it.
and it's so maddening because they had hey, what can I do sitting there from those
Yeah.
sessions. Like
Like, who
hats
made
off.
that call?
I don't know. Anyway, won't stray into the weeds too far. What would your skips be on the three after this?
Oh, half of physical graffiti. No, I kid. Which one do I not like? I would skip like the Wonton song.
Okay.
The Wanton song. How do you pronounce that?
I think
And
it's wanton because it's supposed to be a pun, like
you know,
wanton
I think they
loving.
could have thought of a better spelling for that Wanton.
Yeah.
Um, oh, sick again. Like Black Country Woman, stuff like that, man.
Yeah, I will say Sick Again probably came across better in the live setting, even though Page could be pretty like hit or miss on the solos, but
Yeah.
um
I mean,
pro-
Presence, just like there's a couple songs. It's just like if I was listening to it, like just
mhm.
sporadically, like I didn't set out to listen to the whole thing, but for some reason I clicked and turned on a song. It's like how deep would I listen before I was like, okay, back to regularly
Okay.
scheduled programming. So
Okay,
like
fair.
this is that one album where I just if I randomly turn it on, I will listen to the whole thing. And I have to say, I liked No Quarter better today listening to it than I ever have. Like I like
Really?
it more and more. Yeah.
Hmm.
But I specifically love this album because all of the songs feel perfectly paced. Like sometimes with the live Zeppelin stuff, what loses me a bit is when the songs go on for longer than I think they need to. Like
Hmm.
if it goes beyond 10 minutes, you kind of lose me. Sometimes an exception being made.
Hmm.
I get bored at that point where I'm
Okay.
just like, that's, you could save it for the next time you play it. You don't have to do everything all at once, which I get is the appeal of the band to a lot of people.
Yeah, it definitely can be seen as self-indulgence. But I've kind of always kind of respected the confidence of just like, yeah, we're nobody's gonna tell us that we're playing too long because we're on top of the world, so we're just gonna do whatever we feel like up here.
Yeah, I mean, it's enviable. Like you want to be in that situation.
Mhm.
Sometimes as the listener, I'm just like, it's not for me. I get that's like, you know me, right? Like there
Yeah.
are certain parts of Zeppelin that I love. There are certain parts that I don't necessarily care for.
Mhm.
But like this album to me is a perfect blend of like their like raw power, their composition. is a level up on this album. Like to me, if you listen to Zeppelin 1 and then you listen to this, you're like, wow, that is a quick acceleration.
Well, and I was thinking about that even just with the openers. If you compare Good Times, Bad Times, and the song remains the same, they're both kind of like showing off the virtuosity of all four of them. They're both really energetic openers, but a world of difference in terms of the, tight but loose, bluesy kind of showboating of Good Times, Bad Times to the really tightly orchestrated style of Song Remains the Same.
Yeah, and I find that like if you had to boil this album down to like one or two lyrical topics, what would you describe it as?
Um, I actually noticed a few themes um, in my lyrical analysis yesterday. I would say seeking enlightenment, travel and adventure, um, coming of age, and that like different stages of that sort of journey. Uh, because, well, and I think that ties into the cover with the kids, scaling up this thing. It looks like, okay, they're seeking something, but also it's like, okay, they're growing up, they're doing all that. I think love and romance is there too. um how about you? What would you say?
Yeah, I would agree. To me, it's like if you listen to this start to finish and then like had to in a couple words say you would typically I think say adventure. Like
Mm-hmm.
those other things are incorporated, but they feel like a part of a more grand adventure,
Mm-hmm.
right? Coming of age is a good one that I don't think I had thought of. There is romance there, but there's also uh ambiguity. Like the lyrics aren't explicit like in a sexual manner, like a lot of the Zeppelin stuff tends to be, where it,
Mm-hmm.
you know, we get it, it's clever, it's some way of saying what we all know Robert Plant is actually talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, this almost feels um like a more grown up composition where it's just like they didn't just toss some lyrics. Like I'm trying to think like the songs that I said, like, oh, I don't really listen to those, I'll skip them.
Mm-hmm.
Typically, what gets me turned off is where I just feel like the lyrics are kind of filler. Whereas this album to me really feels like their best, like concise statement. That's really the part I like about it. Like it's 8 songs. Some of the songs are a bit long, but none of them are overboard.
No, and none of them are particularly verbose either, speaking to the lyrics.
And to me, it just better suits my needs as a listener. Listening to like I'm like, oh, that's why it's my favorite. Because it's just like this to me feels like the perfect blend of what Zeppelin was trying to do and what I want to see in an album. Like band aside, just what are you looking for?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, the lyrics are mysterious. Like I love that factor. Right? Like it feels like a book, like one of those grand novels that you just kind of can't wrap your head around how somebody came up with it.
Totally, especially like No Quarter opening with close the door, put out the light, no they won't be home tonight. It's like,
Like, what
whoa.
does that mean?
It's like,
You know?
wow, I've just been dropped in the middle of some story that seems pretty epic.
Yeah, I agree. It kind of feels like coming into a movie slightly after the like inciting moment happened, and you're not exactly sure what's going on, but you know it's ramping up to something.
Mhm. Or like you mistimed your bathroom run in the previews and missed the start.
Yeah. Oh shoot, I missed it. What happened?
Yeah.
Trying to watch the movie.
um I know you've been quite fond of synths lately, and uh Jones makes some great use of them here.
Yeah, I agree. I think Houses of the Holy is like a big, I mean, a bit of a debut in my opinion for Jones in terms of like, oh, I do much more than play the bass, right? Like the first four albums, it's not like he's not doing other stuff, but his biggest part is always his bass,
Mhm.
right? Like that's the connecting factor. Whereas you get to this album and it's like, oh wow, like he's playing the keys on these elegant songs that are so complicated, and you just know like it's like wow, that I did not know he was capable of that. And that gets me to one of the things I wanted to talk about, which was that I think a determining factor for the success of bands can really be affected by the presence of like one of these super musicians that is almost a virtuoso on two, maybe three instruments. Not necessarily someone that can play like guitar, bass, drums, all that, but somebody that can play bass and keyboards and can pick up random other assorted instruments and play them elegantly. That really is what I think of when I listen to John Paul Jones. Like within this grand catalog the Zeppelin has, where it's bombastic and it's huge, and it's just like, wow, though that like you got to pay more attention to the bass playing because it like think of that you're taking attention away from the playing of Bonham and Page. Like that's very hard to get people to turn towards you and think, oh, look at what he's doing. But that's what I constantly find myself doing. And specifically on this album, you see the multi instrumentalism, but you also hear those bass lines and they're just perfect.
Yeah,
Like every song is perfect.
when I ranked their discography back in the fall of 2020, I actually, to my surprise at the time, put Houses number one for his bass playing.
Wow. Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's just like all of his lines are perfect. And they like they really take you from one style to another. Like we were talking about the Jamaica
Mhm.
bass sound, and that's like textbook. Like, oh, you want to make a reggae song? Okay, let's pull up this tone for the bass. Like that's what it should sound like. It's authentic,
Mhm.
but it doesn't sound like a put on either. Like it's perfect every time. And yeah, the no quarter bass to me sounds like he did it with a synth.
I always forget about it because I'm usually listening to the live versions, and then I was like, oh yeah,
Do you know, did he do it with a synth or is
uh,
it bass through some sort of effect?
that I am not sure.
Interesting, because it's like just listening to it. I think that's the most important thing about like actually creating music today is your ability to go listen to something that's old and whether you know like I don't want to look up did he play the bass or did he play it on a synth? If you
Mhm.
can listen to it and go, oh, I could get that sound by plugging my bass into this or by playing it on a synth. I think that's like the most important thing. And listening to Zeppelin, you can pick so many great things that's like you can incorporate into your sound today. Like I think of the drum sound. To me, I don't think there's been any progression that was necessary in the recording of drums since these records. Like this really proved like that's the way to do it. If you can get it to sound like that, you're gold.
Mhm.
And then yeah, the bass stands out all over the album. It's amazing how clear everything to me is because there's a lot going on in the mixes, and it's hard to get everything to stand out the way you want it to.
Yeah, Page actually said something about that himself in one of the somewhere I came across it somewhere recently in my research that he was, really proud of the fact that when you listen to their stuff, you can tell what everybody's doing clearly.
Yeah, I think it's really important too, like long term, because everybody gets their credit when all the parts stand out. Like there are some catalogs where I mean, I guess it'd be on the further back stuff, but I mean, sometimes in the Beatles records, you can't exactly make out what everything is. Like
Mhm.
mostly you can. But when I think about going from that to Zeppelin, where it's so much louder and like really active guitar parts lines while there's a vocal going on. That is really hard to separate that because those like your voice and a guitar have a lot of frequencies that sit in the same range. So they're competing against each other. One over top of the other isn't going to sound like one plus one. It's going to sound like slightly louder than one, more muffled. You can't exactly make everything out. So question, were there engineers present in the recording of this record and anybody helping with production, or is it produced by the band or Jimmy?
Yeah, the credits are actually here on the insert from the vinyl with the lyrics. So Jimmy's the producer, as with all other albums. But Eddie Kramer was like the main engineer, who worked with them a lot in the early days, as well as George. I don't know how to pronounce this. Chkiantz, George Kantz. Anyway, and Keith Harwood, and it was recorded at Mick Jagger's house using the Stones mobile studio, uh, as well as at Island and Olympic in London.
Interesting. Um, I think it's a really, really like, something that has to be recognized that Jimmy produced all these records because I think that's crazy to be in the band but also be producing it like while playing and to get the records to sound this good. I think he probably is the greatest ever artist slash producer that's of like a rock band.
Yeah, for wearing all three hats, like composer, performer, producer. Yeah.
Yeah, like I think McCartney's a great producer, but he didn't produce the Beatles records. You
Hmm.
know, sure. I mean, you may as well have listed him as a co-producer, but it's not the same thing as being the guy.
Yeah.
So yeah, really, I mean, props to Jimmy. His guitar tone on a couple of tracks on this album really stands out. You mentioned, what are your thoughts on the ocean?
Yeah, I think that's got to be one of my favorite tones. The just the level of crunch and stuff, but as you were saying, the clarity within being so like crunchy and overdriven, um, is pretty impressive. And his live tone in '73 is kind of similar to that, like really snarly. Um, but it's almost the opposite to what you have going on the song remains the same, where he's a pretty clean tone throughout, and the thickness is achieved by layering multiple parts on top of each other, each with like pretty clean tones.
I think he's a master of the like there's two schools of thought. It's like give the guitar to the greatest guy you've ever seen play it and just let him play everything he wants in one take and just that's the guitar. And then there's like the boil it down to a couple different parts and then record like dozens of each of them. And I think when you hear his mastery of both, that's probably his most impressive characteristic. Like he has those thick, luscious kind of guitar harmonies. There are these songs where it's kind of like a guitar orchestra of sorts. Like there's so much going on.
Well, this is kind of his first stab at that, I want to say. Song Remains the Same would be. And then he tries it on each of the two subsequent albums, 10 Years Gone, for Physical Graffiti, and then Achilles' Last Stand with Presence, which I would say is the furthest evolution of that sort of concept. And not surprisingly, supposedly it's his favorite Zeppelin song.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's cool to know.
And oddly enough, Plant, well, not oddly, it makes sense to me, but he has singled out the Rain song as one of his best performances.
Yeah, actually, as I was listening to it, I was thinking about he's like perfectly reserved, but not in that song. Like he's still like when he goes for that high note.
Yeah, I
Um,
felt the coldness of my winter. And
yeah,
yeah.
it just gives you chills.
Well, and as so I was telling you how I saw that I think it was somebody in like YouTube comments on some video likened him to a pitcher in baseball who loses their fastball and then actually learns how to like pitch in terms of the art of pitching and like, placement and pacing and all that. Um, and talking about Plant's vocal decline, which this is the first album to come after it starts to take a dive, and I think the Rain song is a great example of him becoming a more nuanced, like well-rounded vocalist and not just relying on, oh well, I have this trump card of this ridiculous high range that nobody else has, so I'll just like let that loose at will.
Well, and there's a beauty to that really because it showcases a more overall mastery, right? Like to impress somebody with your singing without showing off is very difficult because it just is about control and his way of expressing himself, like as you listen,
Mm-hmm.
it's such a distinct form of singing, in my opinion.
How so?
Like it's hard to describe. It's like it's soft yet firm all the time. Even in the more powerful moments, like I try to do that with my voice. You kind of get more of an overall burnout kind of sound where it's like
Mm-hmm.
which you'd never hear him sound like that, like that sound,
Right.
which when you hear people try to mimic him, that is what you hear.
Mm-hmm.
Like I hear not to put them down, but I hear it with Greta Van Fleet. Like when you listen to that, it's like a little too far,
Mm-hmm.
a little too show offy. Where it's like it's great that you can hit those notes, and they have lots of great stuff going on in them. But it's just like see, Plant wouldn't have gone to that extent. He would have pulled it back there.
Mm-hmm.
It's it's like he knows just when to push it. And like, so even in the softer songs, like there are some parts where it's like, wow, that's way up there. But he has a just a form of delivery that to me seems like it would have been very difficult to do because the band is so loud and so full and thick, and that makes you want to sing loud. But that's not what I hear listening to him. It's firm, but it doesn't sound like I feel like if I was standing next to him as he was singing, it's not like he would have been like shouting. It doesn't even sound like belting to me. It
Mm-hmm.
seems so effortless listening to him.
Yeah, I like he probably could have had a good career as a swimmer because I feel like he has like really good breath support.
Oh yeah, I mean, in order to sound as good as he did, whether he did so intentionally or not, his technique was flawless.
Well, it's funny you should say that. I've been really enjoying this YouTube channel called The Charismatic Voice. This woman who's like a professional, or at least was like opera singer, and now she reacts to rock and all that sort of thing. And she's done some Zeppelin videos, and seeing a like legit, like, properly trained vocalist analyze his performances is pretty cool. And she usually does ones with video so she can comment on like his body language and stuff. And I think it was either Nebworth Cashmere or like Since I've Been Loving You from MSG in 73, and he like kind of like throws his whole body into like this big high note that he hits, and she was like, wow, that's just what you want or whatever.
Oh. Yeah, I mean, you definitely, as you listen to it, it to me is like, all four guys in the band at their peak, that's the pinnacle of that instrument. Like, you can do that, you're good. You're gonna make stuff that people want to hear. Um, and what I think about like his vocal performance on this album in particular, like coming off of Zeppelin 4, and you obviously have all of these incredible high points in the first four albums where it's like stunning displays of his vocals. This to me feels like the perfect kind of he knows what he's supposed to be doing. He knows what he's capable of, what he's not always doing. Like, oh, let me go as high as I can just to get up there. right? Like he's having a bit of a decline. He can't sing exactly the same way, but it's better in a way. Like, as you said, it's like at his peak in terms of like your analysis to compare it to a pitcher. He's like 28, has mastered all his pitches, can't exactly throw 101 anymore. It's 99 now,
Mhm.
but it's deadly. It's the perfect combination of all the factors.
Yeah, he actually says something to that effect. Well, 2 years after this, at that March 21st, 75 show in Seattle, that's always been my personal favorite. Like, even though he and Page in particular aren't like quite what they used to be in terms of the set list and the vibes, I really love it. But anyway, he says, before they do the second of only three since I've been loving yous in 75, he says, like, we've been having a great time on tour. And he says, we found that everything we thought we could do well before, we can do better now. But if we were to try to prove that every night, we'd be under doctor's orders, and you have to have other interests when you're on the road. But, because we really dig it here, we're going to pull out all the stops tonight. But
I mean, I think it's great. I think it shows an awareness. And I mean, it would have been interesting to see had their career gone on longer, how they would have morphed into a new thing that, suits how Robert Plant sings maybe on his own records, right? We went and saw him live, and uh, you see him playing some solo tracks, but when he sings the Zeppelin tracks, the ones that he chooses to sing and adapts however necessary were fantastic. Like when he sang "Going to California," I was like, oh, this guy is lights out, like the best singer I've ever seen.
Well, and this is something that one of the aspects of his voice that really starts to shine on this album. I remember reading one time years ago, someone said that he has a very atmospheric or like picturesque voice. And going to California that night was a great example of that. All of a sudden, this 15,000 seat amphitheater feels like we're sitting around a fire somewhere. And No Quarter maybe is the best example of that aspect of his voice. You can hear it on the Rain song too, though.
Yeah, you gotta you feel like you're right next to him in those songs in particular, but in a haunting way where you're like, I could never actually be in the same room as him. It's like he's the perfect narrator almost,
Mhm.
you know? Like you don't want anything else. Like that's I want to hear him tell the story.
Mhm. Or like Kashmir, he kind of paints a picture of a place and then is able to take you there.
Yeah. It's remarkable, really.
Mhm. Um, I thought of something while you were talking that I wanted to ask you. Um, go if you have any random thoughts you'd like to add, fire away. Um, so you've been learning dancing days, uh, and I learned that it was inspired by a song that Page and Plant heard in India, like when they stopped in Bombay on their way home from the Japan 71 tour, which I thought was interesting. But then once I read that, I was like, oh yeah, it does have an Eastern flair, especially the tone of Page's guitar. It kind of has that brassy, like overtone character that a sitar has.
Yeah, well, and really kind of the tip that it's inspired by Eastern music is that it's using a note that like doesn't get used in Western music. So it's like that. So that's a flat five, which is
Okay.
otherwise known as a tritone. Also, there was a misconception, like probably 100 years ago, maybe longer, but like an old myth that note was the devil's music.
Oh,
So its presence in Zeppelin's catalog is kind of intentional, right? They
right.
played with those motifs, right?
Hmm.
Right. People said that and they went along with it, right? Like they almost incorporated it.
Yeah, well, it's like Robert Johnson kind of leaning into oh, he sold his soul to the devil at the crossroads kind of thing. It's like, okay, well, then I'll just like write a song called Crossroads and make a career out of it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the same kind of thing. And yeah, it's an odd note to hear. Like it immediately is like, whoa, what's that? And that's what I think. Like on this album, I really the biggest standout for me is this song. I think it's fantastic. I really don't think it gets enough credit. Um, to me, the stuff after it, like it's almost like there's two climaxes in the album. To me, from the start up until Dancing Days is kind of a winding uh,
Okay.
incline. And then Dancing Days is like, wow. And then Jamaica is a bit of a come down from that of sorts. And then No Quarter is its own thing. But that really like, I mean, it being an 8 song album, obviously there's going to be a couple that stand out and everything else between. I mean, there's not that much. It's not like, oh, the first song, the seventh song, the 11th song are my favorite. It's like,
Mhm.
oh, I looked and I'm just like, okay, well, they're all kind of highlights, really. But for me personally, Dancing Days is a top 5 Zeppelin song. I love it.
I wouldn't have it that high, but it's definitely one of their best, like, tight little poppy songs, which was not their forte. But I think this proves that that's just because that's not what interested them the most to do, not because they couldn't be great at that had they wanted to.
Yeah, I agree.
Um, and with what you're saying about using that flat fifth, the flat five, that's unusual. That's an example of something I noticed where this is really kind of like a hidden or a prog album in disguise. Because on the one hand, it's the sunniest, happiest Zeppelin album by quite a lot. No Quarter is really the only one that's like a downer, quote unquote. Um, and yet you've got stuff like that. You've got the time signature trickery, if you will, with the crunch and the ocean. You've got almost every song is structurally unusual to some extent in terms of like, the song sections and what order they occur in.
What is the timing of the crunch? Because I swear I can count it in four just really sloppily, you know? No, but like I can picture
Yeah.
the
Well,
band being like, we just played it in four, man. I don't know what you're talking about. We just played it with a lot of feel.
but that's the thing. They're so good that they made something that was deliberately undanceable almost sound danceable, because that's how it started. Bonham wanted to like devise a funk groove that stepped on and off the beat so that it was impossible to dance to. Nothing against dancing, because I was actually reading that he and Jones took a lot of pride in the fact that people would dance at their shows because it kind of flies in the face of the notion of them just being heavy-handed like hard rockers, right? Um, but yeah, he wanted to make a funk song that was impossible to dance to. Uh, Yet they almost make it sound like it's in 4/4, but no, it goes between 9/8/4/4 and 3/4 throughout.
Where are the 3/4 bits?
I think it's in the, well, it's not really a chorus, but like the um so you've got the regular like do 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 do, and then the do 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 do. I think it's at the very end of that part when it does the like do 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 do.
Interesting.
I think.
Yeah, and then the rest of it, I mean, 9/8 is close enough to 8/8 that it's like
Hmm.
you can kind of wrap your brain around just not worrying about it and just playing.
Hmm.
When I mean, you're right about the offbeat thing. All of the emphasis is like weird. Like it's not always on beat, it's not always offbeat. Like when it's like the like
Yeah.
that kind of thing makes it really interesting. I know when I listen to it, like sometimes I get bored of 3-minute pop songs that go
Hmm.
right as we all do. And when I listen to a song like this, it really keeps me on the edge of my seat the whole time because I'm like, I'm having a hard time even staying like counting, where I'm like, oh yeah, I know exactly what they're doing.
Hmm.
Like it's almost like a challenge. Like, yeah, try to stay on it. And like you said, if you don't think about it, yeah, 100% you could dance to this. But if you think about it, you're like, I can't dance to this. This is like one of those songs that if I was playing in a band that's doing some covers and they were like, we're gonna do the crunch, I'd be like, oh. And you mentioned that some people have said that the synths in that song are difficult to replicate.
Yeah.
Um, I to be honest, I need to look deeper into what kind of synths he was using.
Hmm.
Um, I, unfortunately, with synths, like there are like replications of things that you can
Hmm.
get, but it at the end of the day, what it's going to sound like comes down to what keyboard you have on hand. Like, there
Right.
are some limitations. Like if he was using a very specific kind of boutique type synthesizer that was made for him,
Hmm.
I would honestly be like, yeah, that's going to be hard to replicate the tones. And when I do listen to the synth work in the whole catalog, but definitely on this album, it sounds like the first time that he's really comfortable with you knowing that it's a synthesizer. Like it's in your face, like
Right.
boom, like
Okay.
that's a synth. There's no doubt about it. There's like it's not a mellotron. It's not. It's like that is a synthesizer. That sounds like 80s music right there. Like
Mhm.
we've moved past just blues rock at this point
Right.
from an instrumentation perspective. So listening to him, it's interesting because it's like a very a mono sound. So with synths, it will either be stereo or mono, and that can be a little confusing how that differs from just like listening to something that's mono versus stereo. With a
Okay.
synth, if it's a mono synth, it literally means you can only play one note at a time. Like it can't play chords and stuff. And so synthesizers like that, when you go from one note to the other, it goes like boom, like
Hmm.
you program it so that it glides at a different rate, and
Right.
it can get very complicated. But all I'm trying to explain is that you can get these very quirky sounds from it, where it's like you're not going to be able to do that with a guitar. Like
Right.
literally, the waveform you're sculpting it in a way where it's just like that. It's not something you could make with a stringed instrument. It's very different. Um, and yeah, I think a lot of the synths are like dry, like on the crunch, those synths are so dry.
Hmm.
Almost to a point where it's frustrating, where it's just like, man, a little reverb would not kill those.
But it almost makes them stick out more because overall, the rest of the album has a fairly wet sound.
Yeah, I would agree. And that is what makes this song sound like the funkiest part of the album. Like it's like, oh, the mix is weird too. Like everything's different. Um, yeah, and then I mean, when I think of no quarter, there's a lot of swells where it's like funky kind of noises. I was going through Walmart grabbing some groceries while I was listening, and of course, no quarter comes on as I
Yeah.
step into Walmart, and I'm just like, oh, this is great. The greeter's like, hi, how you doing? I'm shh.
I'm 2,000 light years from home. Shut
Yeah, man.
up.
And listening to it, I was just like, yeah, there's a lot of synths going on here where I'm like, I'd probably have to listen like a couple dozen times to really pick out all the different sounds that he's got going on, and like try to tell like how many takes was it, like, right? Because like
Mm.
if I'm making music with synths, I'll just sit here and play and play and play, and then I'll edit after the fact. But like he could have been playing a bunch of takes and then selecting from that. But I feel like he probably just played this stuff like rather quickly, honestly.
Mhm.
Like to me, it sounds very fluid, where it's like this is a track and it starts here and then he plays pretty much the rest of the way.
Yeah, well, and I know live he used a Fender Rhodes on No Quarter, so I don't know if that's like the basis of the studio version too, and then like synths
Oh, it
working in as
definitely
well.
is.
Yeah, that's what I
Definitely is.
thought. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
A Rhodes has a very definitive sound. They're like it's a highly sought after sound. It's one of those sounds that because the sound came with the instrument, like it's
Mhm.
not a piano and it's not like a modern keyboard where you click a button and it gives you a new sound. It's like one of those things that is like if you didn't actually have a Fender Rhodes, you could not get it to sound like this. And there's plenty of replications, and in my opinion, nothing ever sounds as good as the real thing.
No.
It really is a cut above, and it gives you that very watery like when the song starts. That is like classic Rhodes sound, where it's like like
Yeah, well, it's used on Riders on the Storm too.
yeah, it's on all kinds of great stuff. I think it's what Billy Preston played when he was with the Beatles. I mean,
Mhm.
everybody had a Rhodes around. That's on a lot of stuff.
Yeah. Um, and I was reading too that there's some interesting like studio techniques applied to Page's solo on No Quarter.
How so? What kinds?
Glad you asked. I forget off the top of my head. Uh, I'm just
Glad
gonna
you
turn.
asked. Thank
I'm
you.
gonna turn my big light off. I feel like the glare's a little.
It's a little late for that.
Feel free to keep the people amused during this quick interlude.
Now brought to you an advertisement. I Oh, he's coming back. Too soon, too soon. I was trying to entertain them, but you did not give me enough time.
Oh, I
I was about to
apologize.
play. Yeah, he could go grab it again. Now
So,
brought to you by Dancing Days.
yeah,
I'm just kidding. I'll give you something.
this looks worse.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, now it looks fuzzy. I'm waiting for Zach to come back on. Okay, that made zero difference when you turn the lights on. It's like your camera, because it's zoom, like adjusted.
Bro, it did so make a difference.
No.
All right. Anyway, um, he applied a very speed to drop the whole song a semitone. Oh, yeah,
Oh, yeah?
yeah. He dropped the whole song a semitone to give it a thicker sound.
Fantastic. I have been doing that with everything to the point that I've annoyed myself, and I have to convince myself that you can record something and release it at the same speed that you did it at. Because it just sounds so great when you slow it down like a touch. It
Mhm.
really you like you wouldn't think that it's like, oh, it sounds way thicker, but it really does everything. And specifically, a lot of times I think the snare drum sounds a lot better when you slow everything together. It's like huge.
I was just gonna say the snare and the ride on this song, they're like during the chorus, it's like wow, that like he is really rocking the behind the beat thing there. Like this sounds huge, and then it's like, oh yeah, that's why.
That's cool to know because yeah, I mean, I think of it as a modern technique, but like turning on
Well,
Verispeed and slowing it down. I mean, it's an old thing. It's, just
mhm.
simply old tape machines and stuff, but a lot of times that would have been accidental, like pre this time. Like if you got something that was slightly slower than they recorded it, maybe it was just something that happened during the mixing stage when the artist wasn't there. You have the Beatles that used it on like Strawberry Fields. Really, once they get into Beyond Rubber Soul, Revolver, they start using it. But it's an odd sound. Like it immediately makes you feel like you're in a different place,
Mhm.
and it functions almost the same way as when bands tune their guitars slightly different, like not necessarily dropping it like a full tone or semitone, like
Mhm.
kind of halfway between, like
Yeah,
slightly flat. It instantly gives you a different sound. Like if you go listen to Hendrix, it's like wow, or like Stevie Ray Vaughan, like that stuff. A lot of it is almost E flat instead of E, like a full semitone down,
yeah,
like they did for that was No Quarter. You said
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And yeah, I think that would have played a big part in making the guitars thick as well. Because slowing it down, it just has this very interesting. way of affecting all the instruments differently, even though it's essentially putting an effect on the whole mix
Hmm.
for the fact. Like in school, they would teach you not to do this. They would be like, do not record your stuff, and then at the very end, go slow it down. It's only going to mess things up.
Hmm.
But every time you do it, you're like, wow, this is awesome. I should do this every time.
Yeah.
And like, no, no, like, because you do lose some quality
Uh-huh.
when you start messing with it. But we're talking a semitone here. Within that, I don't think you're gonna have any noticeable changes. And like we were talking about, you do get some perks that you couldn't get without doing so.
Hmm. Light My Fire is actually an example of what you're saying about it occurring accidentally a lot back then, because I guess because it's at the end of the side, when the tape would be when like most of the reel would be to one side, it would alter the speed of the machine, like when it was being mastered, unless you like until they figured that out and like put something to counteract it. So
Oh wow.
the version on the album ran inadvertently slow because of that. But in the 60s, it was kind of like standard practice to, or not standard maybe, but it was common to speed up singles to make them like pop more on the radio. So the single version was the correct speed because it got sped back up.
Oh wow.
And
Interesting.
then when they discovered it and fixed it on like later remasters, like when I finally heard it at the correct speed, it changes it shortens the running time by like 7 to 10 seconds or something. Um, and I was almost like, I feel like I kind of liked it better the wrong way. Is that weird to say? But now it makes sense.
It's only natural. I think there actually is a fair bit of research. Like there's a bit of a science to this that it's like,
Hmm.
why do our ears find slowed down and sped up stuff so enticing?
Hmm.
It really is true. Like when you said they would slightly speed stuff up for singles, it can be like really easy to overdo when you speed it up.
Hmm.
If you speed it up like 1 or 2 or 3%, and that's how you do so now. Like
Hmm.
I speed up my stuff within Logic, which is a program that I use to record.
Right.
Back then it was a tape machine, so it's slightly different. Like they weren't thinking of it as an I'm speeding it up 7%.
Right.
It was just like, yeah, just okay, that sounds good. Yeah,
Yeah.
keep it. But yeah, if you speed it up like 2 or 3%, it's not so much that it starts making the drums sound like all tinny, like the
Hmm.
snare way too high and like the vocals sounding mousy, but it's enough that it's like, wow, this is fast. It
Hmm.
immediately your brain is just like, whoa, this is different than what we have heard before. And it almost makes it like a totally different version, even though it's entirely the same track.
Yeah. Well, and they did do some speeding up on this album, particularly Plant's vocals on the song remains the same,
Cool. I
which
like
gives
that.
it that kind of like just sucked helium sort of effect.
I love that technique actually. Like I have wanted to start using it to record harmonies that would be too high for me to normally do, recording them and then speeding them up so that it's like a higher note than you actually sang, but
Hmm.
using it in a creative way where it's like I could never get that sound. Like maybe I could sing the note falsetto, but it's not going to sound like that.
I feel like that would have been difficult back then for them to get it perfectly in sync, to like have him like, okay, you're listening to the backing track and like, okay, sing a little too fast or a little too slow so that when we speed your vocal track up, it'll like fall right in line.
Well, probably what they did for it was they slowed the tape down as they recorded him. So then he just sang it normally in sync. And then when you set the tape back to like standard,
Oh,
then his
true,
voice
yeah.
sounds a little higher.
Oh, that would make sense, yeah.
Yeah, because the other way is crazy.
Um,
But I'm sure people tried it at different points.
uh, so the other part about the actual thing I was looking for with the respect to Page on No Quarter, so his guitar is really compressed, which is a tone kind of unique to them, but also during the solo, It says the effect was achieved by direct injection and compression.
Oh, DI. So rather than using an amp going straight into the board, I think is what they're getting at
Yeah.
there. Yeah, it's a specific tone. I mean, when you use an amp, there are a lot of variables affecting the tone, and it's like you get that effect where it's like 1 plus 1 no longer equals two. It
Mhm.
all depends. What's the volume on the guitar? What's the volume on the amp? Like all this stuff matters. Like you can set your guitar and amp to have like 4 or 5 different settings, or try it 4 or 5 different times. Get it to be the same volume on each, but the tone is completely different depending
Mhm.
on what you're doing. So that's only more pronounced when you just plug straight into the board. It literally, that's what your guitar sounds like. Nothing
Yeah.
else affecting it. Like that's a Stratocaster, that's a Les Paul, that's how it sounds.
Okay.
It's very like,
Yeah.
and then you can add effects to it after. Like I record pretty much everything DI. Um, Recording with amps has become a little outdated just because of people recording at home and it not being practical.
Mhm.
But also that you can achieve really great tones without the presence of amps. And of course, that is a popular way of doing things for people doing making records in bedrooms and apartments and stuff. It's interesting that a band that was in world class studios could do whatever they wanted, still chose to operate that way from time to time.
Yeah, and this is one of the ones that was done in studio, not with the mobile at Jagger's house.
Very interesting. And also, well, the other factor would be depending on the studio you're at, they would have a different soundboard. Those have different tones.
Right.
Like, and depending on what kind of gear it is, like there is a difference between like serial number 00001 and 00002.
Yeah.
It was made identically, and you would expect like it should sound the same, but sometimes you will have identical pieces of gear that do have different sounds, and that would be more common back then. So like it's interesting that they would choose to DI at a studio where, like, to me, Jimmy comes across as a bit of like a he would be very controlling about his guitar tone. Like he would know what he's looking for. He wouldn't be relying on an engineer. He'd be like, I want this tone.
Mhm.
But I think it's an added layer to them. I think it really shows off his brilliance in the studio, because you're not relying on, oh, that amp sounds great because it's so loud. It really just is your fingers.
Mhm. Well, that's part of why they're my favorite too. I think they have the highest combination of like studio and live greatness. Like, sure, the Dead are amazing live, but they only really captured their lightning in the bottle in the studio twice. And the Beatles, amazing in the studio, but after the early days, by choice or by the technological limitations of the day, never really got to play their best stuff live.
Yeah, 100%. I think, yeah, and I do think the Zeppelin records, in my opinion, are cut above. Like when you look at the Stones catalog overall, now obviously it's diluted. There's so much in it that it's like, okay, well, I mean, look at the peak. As
Right.
we've talked about, like these big bands, you can compare their peaks, pretty much all of them. Like if you
Yeah.
take their best album, pretty comparable in terms of,
Hmm.
wow, that's impressive. And um, but I think that the actual like the sound of the records, like how well done they are,
Hmm.
uh, I think that Zeppelin and the Beatles are at the top for me for that. And because they recorded uh, in the 70s rather than the 60s, I do think there is an upper hand there where it's just like we'll
Yeah.
never know what the Beatles would have sounded like making records in the 70s, like all together. But I'm
Right.
like, you cannot argue that the best sound of the 70s was Zeppelin overall, consistently the whole time.
I I'd put Pink Floyd in that discussion too for sound quality of the studio albums.
Yes.
They got some pretty good ear candy.
Yeah, you're right. 100%.
But I would say this is Zeppelin's best album just in terms of sonic palette. Um, as far as like having like a unique and like kind of distinct sound in that sounds different to anything else, but also pretty diverse and eat from one song to the next. There's a fair bit of difference too.
Yeah, I think it's really a great blend of all the different things they excelled at, and I'm sure your Zeppelin fans that are listening agree. I'd love to hear where everybody ranks it in their you know, top Zeppelin albums or top albums overall. I think I'd have to uh, think about where this sits for me all time records ever because it is my favorite Zeppelin one. So I think it's top five then for me.
That that might be the only um Zeppelin album that places higher on your list than mine.
Yeah,
It's in my top 10, but it didn't crack top five when I made my list back in the summer
very interesting.
because I gave four the number one spot. And then it was Sergeant Pepper, Sticky Fingers, American Beauty, Blonde on Blonde. Uh, and then Houses could come in as high as like right after that. It was kind of between it, Revolver, Physical Graffiti, and Exile for me.
I definitely think that is the first time that's ever happened, actually. Certainly with a Zeppelin album that I have it higher in mine than yours.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there you
Um,
go. That is my seal of approval on this album.
yeah, there you go. One final, I guess we can let you go with this. Um, Over the Hills and Far Away has gotten a lot of love on ranking lists, like ranking Zeppelin songs in recent years, and a few of them have even put it number one, arguing that it kind of has a little bit of everything that made them great, but in such a concise and like pretty catchy by their standards, like package.
They've got a point.
Yeah, I thought so too.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. That begs the question, and I'll have this answer for you next time we talk. Then, what is the best song on this album? Not my favorite, the best in terms of what's the biggest statement. You know, put catchiness aside and
Hmm.
like how concise it is.
Yeah,
You know, because really, when I think of Zeppelin, I think of these magnum opus songs, these grand journeys, right?
yeah, they're yeah, epics were their thing, really.
That's,
Uh,
you know, that's kind of the idea. So I think No Quarter would be in there. I think the Rain song is way like such an understated song that it's way lower on a lot of people's rankings than it should be.
yeah, well, I sent you that quote from Rick Rubin about like it defies classification. Like I don't even know what to compare it to. It's
Yeah.
um he had a great quote about No Quarter too, actually, about talking about song structure. He said it takes such confidence to be able to get really quiet and loose for such a long time. Zeppelin completely changed how we look at what popular music can be.
I think that sums it up perfectly. I can't say anything better than that.
Right on. Well, thank you as always for joining us. I don't even think we've planned out when you're coming on next. I don't even really know what I'm talking about. Much of the rest of the spring, I know I have it in my spreadsheet. I know talking about ACDC's Powerage for 45th anniversary. No. uh, how about a Jumpin' Jack Flash 55th anniversary?
You got a deal.
Right. We'll talk about Beggar's Banquet and the White Album later in the year, but the Jumpin' Jack Flash single came out in May '68.
Heck
So
yeah.
you'll
Well,
all
okay.
will hear from Spence in about a month. We'll probably film that too.
Well, thank you for having me back and nice talking to you all. Enjoy your listening. Houses of the Holy now playing.